Setting the scene is kind of like moving pieces into position in a game of chess before you execute a plan. Checkmate. You could almost say setting the scene is complicated. We immediately jump to describing the environment, the time and place, but setting the scene is so much more than that. And to understand how, we're going to take a look at a ton of stories from a ton of different genres and a bunch of different writers and styles to show you how you can discombobulate your readers to set up that king and knock them down. And we're going to start with one of the perhaps most famous scenes ever, the Red Wedding. Part 1. Moving pieces into position. The drums were pounding, 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 and her head with them. Pipes wailed and flutes trilled from the musicians' gallery at the foot of the hall. Fiddles screeched, horns blew, the skins skirled in a lively tune, but the drumming drove them all. The sounds echoed off the rafters while the guests ate, drank, and shouted at one another below. Walter Frey must be deaf as a stone to call this music. Catelyn sipped a cup of wine and watched Jingle Bell prance to the sounds of Alisan. At least she thought it was meant to be Alisan. With these players it might as easily have been the Bear and the Maiden Fair. Most of the heat came off the bodies of the wedding guests, jammed in so thick along the benches that every man who tried to lift his cup poked his neighbour in the ribs. If you don't know about the Red Wedding, well, first, how? And secondly, I'm gonna spoil it for you, unless you click away from this video in 3, 2, 1... Alright, the Red Wedding is a famous scene where a king and all his army are massacred at a wedding dinner by supposed allies. And look at how Martin writes this. He describes the setting, the musicians' gallery, the rafters, a place to dance, the crammed benches, but he's not only doing that. Look at the language being used here. Wailing, trilling, screeching, skirling. These are the sounds of people dying. The last line about the heat of the bodies jabbing people in the ribs, all of this could be applied to a battle scene, to a massacre. The song, Alisan, that's mentioned in the passage, is sad, but it's being played as if it's a joyous, upbeat tune, to sound celebratory and happy, much like a wedding which is secretly about to become a massacre. All of this is foreshadowing the events of the scene to come, as well as establishing an atmosphere for it. It's oppressive, it's crowded, it's uncomfortable. Martin's writing introduces the idea of death and horror without explicitly telling us, creating that uncomfortable atmosphere which sets us up for the massacre to come. And these are just two of the things you can do while setting the scene outside of giving us environmental description. Except Martin did something else really clever here, which you might have noticed when you first read this passage if you've read the books. The wording here for the drums, the pounding, pounding, and pounding, it comes back later in the scene. The pounding drums sets the scene as part of a musical ensemble, but they return as drums of war, whilst Catelyn is literally pressing a knife to someone's throat. This is what we can call linguistic Chekhov's gun, where language you use while setting the scene returns in your prose later on with greater or a different meaning, to make that twist or that reveal, that move, that plan that you execute hit harder. These are your bishops, your poetic pieces you bring in earlier on, only to bring back later with effect. In this way, setting the scene isn't just describing the setting or foreshadowing, but choosing what language, metaphor, simile, or description might elevate the scene to come. A cracked altar is just an altar until the bride leaves the ceremony in tears. And suddenly, a cracked altar is a lot more than that. Like how you might only reveal why you moved a certain piece into position once you execute your plan, how you set the scene might only reveal its full meaning once you carry out the rest of the scene. I really love having these writing discussions, and I'm loving this chess metaphor in case you haven't noticed. I hope this makes the idea of setting the scene a bit more interesting, dynamic, but also kind of easier and applicable to your writing. That's what I try to do in these videos. It's actually why I've written 3 whole books on it, and On Writing and World Building Volume 3 is the latest one of those out now. Almost 100,000 copies have been sold of this series so far. I can't even begin to explain how incredible that is for me. And Volume 3 is the biggest and most in-depth and most exclusive in the series so far, with a cover voted for by you guys. These books take all of the writing and world-building discussions, like the one that we're having in this video, and put them into these more easily accessible, referenceable books with a ton more notes and depth than we are able to get into in the videos. And in fact, this particular one has about 30,000 more words worth of analysis than I was able to do here. And you might be wondering, do I have to have read volumes 1 and 2 to read volume 3? And no, not at all. Each book stands entirely on its own. Of course, they do work together. They all cover their own topics though. I'm so excited to share this one with you. This is easily the best book yet. I am so happy with it. And if you find videos like these today helpful, then this is the next step. This is what I am going to point you towards. The links are down below. Thank you so much to the people who have already got it. It's an amazing thing to be able to share this with you. And you can get all three pretty cheaply together. Volume 3 in particular covers things like character descriptions, subtext and dialogue, show don't tell, plot armor, environmental descriptions like we reference in this video, anti-heroes, world building mountains and cities and towns, all sorts of incredible stuff. As said, links down below. Let's get on to more of the writing stuff. Part 2.
Discombobulate.
Now we've talked about foreshadowing and linguistic Chekhov's gun, but there are other pieces that you might want to move into position. You've got character and tension and relationship and emotion, and there's really no better writer to explore this than Gillian Flynn with her incredible book, Sharp Objects. My mother's massive house is at the southernmost point of Wind Gap. The wealthy section, if you can count approximately 3 square blocks of a town as a section, she lives in, as I once did too, an elaborate Victorian replete with a widow's walk. The Victorians, especially southern Victorians, needed a lot of room to stray away from each other, to duck tuberculosis and flu, to avoid rapacious lust, to wall themselves away from sticky emotions. Extra space is always good. When I was a child, I always walked the stairs up, ran the driveway down. I assumed the cigar-thin rail was on the left side going up because I'm left-handed, and someone thought I might like that. Odd to think I had ever indulged in such presumptions. I parked at the bottom, so as to seem less intrusive. Wet with sweat, by the time I hit the top, I smelled, as my mother would say, ripe. Gillian Flynn is just one of my favorite authors ever. She has this deeply psychological writing. She gets into people's minds, into her characters' brains in ways that other authors don't. And that really comes out in how she sets a scene, like this. Lines like, Victorians needed a lot of room to stray away from each other, or parking to seem less intrusive. They speak to the relationship she has with her mother. That distance core to the tension of the scene to come. Flynn could have described her relationship with the family cat, but the scene isn't about that. It's about her mother. The line about how she used to think the rail was on the left because of her speaks to the mindset and emotional state of our character. She used to believe she belonged in this place, but no longer. All of this sets the stage for the scene to come. This is Flynn moving those pieces into position, pieces which are relevant to the scene, which will make the scene, the tension, the relationship as it plays out, hit better and hit harder. When she captures this feeling of being isolated from her old home, it's because that feeling is critical to the scene to come. A scene will often be about a goal, or a conflict, or a decision, or an emotional reaction, or a dilemma. And setting the scene is about giving us the context to make that mean something. Even before we meet the mother, even before the conflict starts, even before a line of dialogue is uttered, we are already on edge from how Flynn sets her scene. She grounds us in the mindset of her character so well, who is nervous and on edge and doesn't really know what to expect. And so she's got all of these pieces moved into position so that she can discombobulate. I can't wait for all the comments telling me about the abysmal and illegal moves I'm technically making if you look too closely at the chessboard. But we can go deeper. I want to show you a piece from a short story called The Life and Death of Lucia's Library and ask what you think this scene is going to be about. Lucia Vargas knew death before she knew how to walk. Death lived in a book at the top of their family library on the second floor, its cover of pressed feathers plucked from the loose scraps of her cloak, and its spine sealed with candle wax left in her footsteps. It had always kept her close to the family. Inside, a Nephilim tree grew from page to page, each branch a different member of Lucia's family, going back countless generations. As a child, she always feared it would run out of pages, but Ma assured her it never had, never would, never could. Death don't run out, and neither do we, she said. If you guess this scene involves someone dying, you'd be right. Lucia's grandmother is found in her bed, mouth agape, shoes covered in drool and puke. And this is actually one of my stories, and I want to show you which pieces I was moving into position and why, and let me know what you picked up on. We immediately get Lucia's complex and intimate relationship with death, while the scene itself is about those different relationships others in her family can have with death. They're obsessed with it or fearful of it, running from it. The line, "death don't run out," brings in that tension. It is always coming for them, and they learn to live with it. The book itself is critical to the scene because it's how Lucia discovers her grandmother is dead. She sees that branch taper off in the book. I wanted to introduce all these pieces so that when the grandmother dies, we're left with this sense of inevitability that kind of numbs the loss and sets up the story to come where many more people will die. And yet Lucia lives through it. And even though her ma assures her, neither do we very quickly see this family is dwindling. The story as a whole is about the different ways we engage with death, and all of this is way more important than the fact that there's a library, which would be setting the scene, giving us the setting. But it's not what the scene's really about, and there are two parts to this, right? There's the setting and the scene. And if you want to read more of this story, then do go get my book, A Catalogue for the End of Humanity, which, as I say on the back, these are stories about death, endings, and finding hope somewhere in between. This is the most personal thing that I have ever written, and I'd love to share it with you. It's got a ton of my professionally published fiction, which I'm really proud of, but also a ton of original, exclusive stories like The Life and Death of Lucia's Library. Writing is who I am on a core level, and I can finally share this with you. This is also the most direct way that you can actually support me personally. I put everything I talk about in these videos into practice in my own writing, and that is why I am so confident in this book. Again, links down below. Thank you everybody who gets my books, but especially this one, because this is just so personal to me. Another way to imagine scenes is as shifts in emotions or belief. Like, Catelyn Stark begins one way and ends up another. In this case, bleeding out and extremely sad her son is dead, but you're setting the scene by establishing where that change is going to come from, moving that piece in. Hence why Flynn writes so much about that family dynamic in Sharp Objects. The character starts the scene nervous, and she ends up leaving it tired and frustrated with her family. A character might have a lot of emotions about a lot of different things, but you've got to be conscious of bringing the right emotions to the forefront of the reader's mind to set them up for where that shift is going to come from. But let's talk about a more tangible thing. Part 3. Chekhov's actual gun. On a more structural level, scene setting includes establishing important set pieces, objects, environmental obstacles which will become relevant later in the scene. In The Red Wedding, it's important to establish the rafters because that's where the massacre comes from. In The Phantom of the Opera, they very much establish the giant chandelier because later on, it falls down. If doors suddenly start appearing where the reader didn't know they were and the characters can escape through them, or they end up using conveniently placed guns on the walls, it can feel a little too much like, "A wizard did it." You want to introduce or at least imply things which would be unexpected in your setting, or at least important for how the scene will play out, especially if characters benefit from it. It matters less if they're put at disadvantage because a sudden trap appears, but if they're in a classroom, we probably expect chairs and windows, right? But if they're in a bank vault, tell us about the weird crack in the wall that they might be able to exploit later. And this applies more broadly, by the way, to the tension, character, relationships, and emotions which are going to come up in the scene later on. As said, characters are feeling a lot of different stuff in any given scene, but only some of it's going to be relevant to this particular scene, and they're the pieces that you're probably going to want to move into position more. Like how Flynn focuses on that family dynamic, or when Martin is writing about Catelyn's emotional state at the start of the scene, you get the impression she's a little bit apart from the ceremony and festivities that are going on. She's not quite as absorbed in the affairs of the wedding as others. And that does set up how she eventually notices the massacre right before it's about to happen. She recognizes the reigns of Castamere, which is the signal for the massacre. Of course, I'm not saying you want to telegraph what's going to happen in your scene. This is something to keep in mind when editing, perhaps. Am I building up to the point of the scene? Is my introspection and my focus in the right place? Could the tension or pacing be elevated by setting the scene through the lens of a different relationship or perspective or emotion? All of this is about keeping the intent of the scene in mind when you're setting it. Just like moving pieces throughout the board is going to change where the conflict is happening, where will this scene guide the narrative? Where will it shift the relationship that the reader has with the story? So that's one way of thinking about your scene, but another one is part 4, questions and answers. You are asking questions when you set the scene. Will this happen? What will happen if X? Will they manage to Y? And you give answers in playing the scene out. For an example, let's take a look at this passage from Rebecca Campbell's An Important Failure, a story about a guy who spends much of his life working on a violin for a woman he has known since she was a little girl. Even from his bed, even on oxygen, Eddie was critical when Mason brought it upstairs, examining it with an eyeglass until he conceded the sound was as fine, in its own way, as any number of other violins he'd seen. Finer even than the composites he'd started to use for his own work, when he could work. Chlorine and carbon fiber. You made something, kid. It had been a long time since anyone called him kid, even Eddie. Does it have a name? Eddie asked. Does it need one? If it had to be named, it should have been something elegant and sonorous. This passage is given at the beginning of the scene, before we actually meet the woman that he's gonna give the violin to, which is the intention of the scene. This is him giving this thing that he's been working on for his entire life. And in setting the scene, Campbell introduces a blatant question. Does the violin have a name? And in the scene, it gets one. Nepenthe. Campbell asks this question in setting the scene and answers it. But this question is also symbolically important. Nepenthe was a fictional medicine for sorrow, a drug of forgetfulness, and by this point in the story, the woman has kind of forgotten the joy that playing the violin ever brought her when she was younger. But scene-setting questions are rarely so literal. I've been really enjoying Savannah Brown's The Things We Don't See, where we get this little line of introspection when describing the environment of this small-town island. Beside me, there's a lighthouse, a colossal thing. Floating towards it happens naturally, a moth drawn to the flame, and I want to go in. This line immediately begs the question, what's in the lighthouse? I want to know. You want to go in? I want to go in. And the conflict of this scene is that a police officer comes along and warns her to stay away and takes her away from the lighthouse. And you kind of, go, no, I want to go in. And you know that you'll return there. Because more importantly, this establishes the importance of the lighthouse in the story more broadly. Too often, we get caught up in just describing stuff, things that are just there. Characters arrive in a place and we give them a big laundry list of stuff which happens to be around them. And then we go on and just do the scene of what happens there. But that's kind of like moving random pieces into position and then trying to execute a plan with whatever pieces we happen to have, right? It doesn't work, it's a scatter shot. I can't take down the king with these random pieces. It might tell us where we are, but it doesn't lay a strong foundation for the plan and scene to come. What all of these stories have in common is that they're very conscious of the story that they're trying to tell within the scene that they're setting. However, you've also got to think about the place of the 1 scene and 2 elements inside the scene within the broader narrative as a whole, because sometimes there are elements which might not be hugely relevant to the actual scene at hand, but are going to be relevant to later scenes later on. And to explain what I mean, we're going to look at the opening scenes to Brandon Sanderson's recent book, Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. Yumi had always considered the appearance of the day star to be encouraging, an omen of fortune. It seemed extra bright today, glowing a soft blue on the western horizon as the sun rose in the east, a powerful sign, if you believed such things. The day star itself isn't actually that important for the scene at hand. It's not the subject of tension or a relationship or the intention of the scene really, but the point of this book is how it parallels the stories of 2 characters. They sort of end up swapping lives, sort of Your Name style, if you've seen that. And in the first chapter of the other character, we also get this. The star was particularly bright when the Nightmare Painter started his rounds. The star. Singular. No, not a sun, just one star. A bullet hole in the midnight sky. Bleeding pale light. Again, it's not all that important for the scene at hand, but the wider parallel it creates between these 2 characters and their important differences are central to the overall story. Just in this little flash, we can see how they think differently about the star. Yumi sees it as a sign of hope. Painter describes it with imagery of death, a bullet hole bleeding. Right from the start, we get the impression that these 2 are on the same journey in a sense. They're facing the same problem, they see the same things, though in different ways. And it's also an important set piece for the story, kind of like the chandelier in Phantom of the Opera. It will come back later. You're going to have a lot of symbols in your story which appear in one scene, but don't necessarily become relevant till a lot later on. So spending words on them in that case when you're setting the scene is still worth it. This also applies, by the way, to that linguistic Chekhov's gun we spoke about before. Language which you introduce at one point to become more relevant, more meaningful, different later on, even if it's not in this scene. And this is, by the way, more common at the start of books where you're introducing the characters and establishing the world a bit more, like with Yumi here. But it applies where any given scene has an important, especially symbolic role to play in the wider story, feeding into those connections to other events, characters, and stories, which knits the whole narrative together. And we really see that in Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. His scene setting there is about the wider parallel in the narrative than about the individual scene that we actually see that in. Now you're probably wondering, we're talking about setting the scene, why aren't we talking about environmental descriptions? And we will in a bit. But I really want to drive home that scene setting is often a lot more dependent on introspection than on time and place and physical setting. And we've seen that in the examples we've discussed, in The Life and Death Lucia's Library, in Sharp Objects, in An Important Failure, in Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. And that's because the environment is almost always filtered through the lens of a particular character. And the introspection is often a lot closer to what the actual story is really going to be about, the stuff that gets us grounded in this world. And scene setting is often pretty introspective because we can sometimes presume where a scene is taking place because it might have been established earlier on in the story, or because it's implicit in other details and doesn't really require much description. However, it is still inescapable, I'm not trying to step around it, that a huge part of setting the scene is Part 6, environmental descriptions. Now, I have done not only a whole video on environmental descriptions before, but there's a whole chapter on it in this book with a ton of more notes and detail. So if you really want to dig into that quite fundamental part of writing, get this book and read that chapter. But I want to narrow in on some details around setting the scene specifically. The first being, set it with an active character. Halfway down the trailer, Elena slips into the woods behind a fallen larch tree. Wet clusters of tissue mark it as a common detour. Steaming urine splashes against the back of her calves and pools in the moss under her runners, before sinking away. I'm sorry for such a visceral description, but having your characters do something with their environment, engaging with it, sets the scene off at a pace while helping you establish the setting. The character here is interacting with specific details. They're moving through the woods, looking for somewhere to go to the bathroom. So we get the woods and the fallen trees, the tissues, the moss, before we launch into the core of the scene. And more importantly, we'll discover later on in this scene, there's this strange mucus in the forest. They describe it as, quote, thick, gloopy, and wet, a star jelly. So already starting with bodily functions like this kind of fits the theme. It introduces and seeds that idea to foreshadow what's to come. Having your character do something avoids your scene setting from feeling static, like you're putting the whole story on pause so that you can quickly describe the setting before moving on, calling it to a grinding halt. It immediately sets your character up to discover something, or to be interrupted, or to pursue something, all of which are a lot more interesting than just having a static setting. If they're in a market, describe the characters perusing the goods. If they're in a rural town, have them driving through the empty, abandoned streets full of run-down, dilapidated houses. But, and this is something a lot of people miss, an active opening to the scene isn't limited to a character physically interacting with their surrounding. It often helps, but introspection can give pace to a scene too. The examples from Flynn's writing and Brown's writing do exactly that, internalizing what they're seeing, and that internalization actually moves the story forward. It develops our expectations for the scene, our relationship with the character, with the setting. It's what I'm going to call psychological movement as opposed to physical movement in setting the scene, and it's just as important. But scene setting is also about the atmosphere, the vibes, you might say. I mean, that's what it is, right? And a lot of this is going to come down to your word choice and which details you include. Let me explain. When we spoke before about the red wedding feeling claustrophobic and joyless, that's the vibes, that's the atmosphere. We're meant to feel that in the scene. It's the character of the physical setting. If we return to Flynn's writing, she could have described anything about this house, but she deliberately chooses details which make the atmosphere feel isolating, unwelcoming, alienating. The huge amount of space, comparing the people to tuberculosis, the southernmost point. Her word choice is intentional. The rail is not slender, but thin. It is not a candlestick, but a cigar, a poisonous object of addiction, like this house is full of disease. The vibes of this place are all off. It might be true that there is a beautiful garden full of lively and colourful birds, a whole place full of life and wonder and colour. But narrowing in on those details when setting the scene for this house would have given us the wrong atmosphere, the wrong vibes. But that's because, and this is the key point, so much of environmental description isn't about just giving us details about the physical setting, but about what the place feels like. And so you've got to be deliberate in crafting that. What happens in the scene might change how you want it to feel. If your characters are about to get mugged in the middle of the night, then a foreboding and grim atmosphere sets the stage for that tension. You're going to describe the flickering neon lights and the echoes of movement in the shadows. Alternatively, you might give atmosphere to create contrast with whatever's going to happen. Listen to the environmental description Catherine Patterson gives us in the scene right before she reveals Leslie is dead in Bridge to Terabithia. When they came out of the building, it was into brilliant spring sunshine. The western sun danced on the windshield, dazzling his eyes. It's hopeful, it's bright, it's happy, it's a great time, right? This is a nice atmosphere to be in, all to make that sudden reveal so much darker. You can also use atmosphere to establish character, right? Like most people would feel unsafe in a dark alleyway at night, but you might describe them as skipping through the shadowed, narrow alleys, moonlight peeking through the clouds. And what does that give us? What atmosphere is that? This tells us that the character feels pretty at home out here, that it is not a creepy atmosphere for them. Maybe they grew up on the street, or they're a vigilante who was born in the dark, molded by it, and they did not see light until they were already a man. The atmosphere changes with the perspective character. Again, we see that in Flynn's work, right? Because they have a different experience of the place. And the other most important tip in writing environmental descriptions, and this kind of applies to most kind of descriptions and most of writing, I've discussed it before, you've heard me say it, and I'm gonna say it again, say it with me, specificity. Specific details are almost always more grounding, immersive, and effective than generalizations. In my story, The Life and Death of Lucia's Library, I didn't just describe a dark book, but one with a cover of pressed feathers plucked from the loose scraps of Death's cloak. Flynn doesn't just describe an old, large Victorian house, but one full of cubbyholes and nooks, curiously circuitous. Specificity allows you to craft the feeling, experience, atmosphere of a place, an object, a person that you want. Right? And when each scene has a specific intention, you got to keep that in mind when you're setting it. A last thing to keep in mind is proportionate scene setting. This is a problem I've seen a lot. You know, some scenes are short and relatively inconsequential. And that's okay, you know, they don't need a lot of scene setting or environmental description in that case. But I've seen this a lot before. Imagine the characters pull up at a lakeside for one night, and the author goes on to give this beautiful, elaborate, 3-paragraph long description about how the frogs jump from lily pad to lily pad, and the soft dusk fog scatters the last of the sunlight. But then the characters don't do anything there. They just kind of go to sleep, and that was meant to tell us where they are. It's that compulsion to describe whatever happens to be around our characters, that idea that we must know exactly what's around them at all times, that drives people to do this. You've got to make sure your reader knows, but it's, again, kind of like moving all these pieces into position, but then doing nothing with it, executing no plan. Of course, maybe it's just your style, and that's okay. If you want to describe the lily pads and the fog because you like lily pads and fog, it's your book, it's up to you. But you do got to keep in mind kind of which scenes matter and how much description and scene setting you really need for them. And also remember that your readers can imagine a lot, often better than we can ever describe it, and inviting them into the process where they're allowed to imagine and impose their kind of vision for the world on your book, that can be really useful, and you can learn how to utilize that. And if you want more detail, pick up on Writing World Building Volume 3. It is really where all the goodies are stored. But let's bring all of this into a summary. First, setting the scene is like moving pieces into position in a game of chess. These pieces are tension, relationship, objects, character, and emotion, all to make the scene hit home. Secondly, look for how you can foreshadow your scene in setting it. Consider using the linguistic Chekhov's gun to bring language used earlier on back into the scene with new or greater meaning. Thirdly, establish important objects, set pieces, and other things which will give your characters an advantage in the scene. Fourthly, scenes can be understood as questions and answers. What questions do you ask in setting the scene? These questions do not need to be literal. Alternatively, what shift in emotion does your scene setting set up? 5. Consider the place and meaning of the scene within the overall narrative and the elements inside it, not just the events of the scene itself. 6. Scene setting is often thought of as establishing only time and place, but introspection is often a much more important element. 7. Consider setting your scene with an active character interacting with the environment, both physically and psychologically. 8. Atmosphere arises from your word choice, which details you focus on, and how your perspective character interprets their surroundings. You can also use atmosphere to build towards or contrast with the events of the scene itself. And 9, the most important point, get my short story collection and my writing books at the link down below to really deepen your studies and see some of my work. And that's some of my scene setting, but I want to see some of yours. Share it down in the comments. Show me how you would set a scene. Stay nerdy, and I'll see you in the future.